In the early 2000s, Gabon, a small but stunningly rich country located on the west coast of Central Africa, found itself at the center of a significant international deal. Gabon is known for its lush rainforests, its biodiversity, and its large, natural resources, which include oil, timber, and fish. The country's long coastline, stretching over 800 kilometers, is home to some of the world's most valuable fishing grounds, which hold an abundance of species such as tuna, sardines, and shrimp. At the time, Gabon's fishing industry wasn't as developed as it could have been. While the country had the resources, it lacked the technology, infrastructure, and experience to fully tap into this sector. This is where the European Union, EU, stepped in. The EU, made up of many nations, was constantly in need of fish for its people. Seafood had become a significant part of European diets, and the demand was growing steadily. However, European waters were no longer able to provide enough fish. Overfishing and environmental issues had led to a decline in the amount of fish that could be caught off the European coasts. As a result, European countries began to look elsewhere for reliable sources of seafood. Gabon, with its rich and largely untapped fishing grounds, seemed like the perfect solution. In 2002, after some negotiations, Gabon and the European Union entered into a fishing agreement. The agreement allowed European fishing fleets to operate off Gabon's coast, harvesting fish from its waters. In return, the EU promised to provide Gabon with financial aid, technological support, and help in developing its fishing industry. For Gabon, the agreement was seen as a win. The country lacked the resources and the expertise to fully exploit its fishing potential. The financial support from the EU was seen as a necessary boost to develop its infrastructure. Gabon's fishermen were provided with modern equipment, and the government was given a chance to build better ports, improve fish processing facilities, and develop skills within the local population. On the other hand, Europe saw the deal as a chance to ensure a steady supply of fish for its markets. Access to Gabon's waters was seen as essential for keeping the European fishing industry strong. The EU had already struck similar agreements with other African nations, but Gabon's waters, rich in resources, were a particularly important prize. In the years that followed, both parties appeared to benefit from the deal. Gabon used the money it received from European nations to fund projects to improve local fisheries. The country worked on expanding its ports and improving the livelihoods of local fishermen. It wasn't just about the money. The Europeans helped Gabon modernize its fishing techniques. Local fishermen learned new methods for catching and preserving fish, and fishing became an even bigger industry in Gabon. For Europe, the deal meant the continuation of an important food source. European boats were able to access rich fishing waters without the limitations of their own country's overfished areas. The seafood they caught in Gabon's waters was brought back to Europe, where it was sold in markets, restaurants, and grocery stores. As Europe's appetite for seafood grew, Gabon's fishing grounds became even more important to the European economy. At first, the agreement was a win-win situation. Both sides were happy with the arrangement. Gabon had more money to invest in its development, while Europe had the fish it needed. There was even talk of expanding the agreement, with Gabon looking to increase its share of the financial benefits and improve local employment in the fishing sector. However, while the EU agreement seemed successful on the surface, there were hints of trouble that would start to surface in the following years. There were small signs that not everything was as it seemed. As the fishing fleets operated off Gabon's coast, questions began to arise about the long-term effects of this agreement. The fish were being caught at an alarming rate, and some people in Gabon began to wonder if the country was receiving its fair share of the benefits. Despite these early concerns, the relationship between Gabon and Europe continued to grow. As time passed, both parties seemed to settle into their roles. The European boats continued to fish off Gabon's coast, and the Gabonese government worked on improving the country's fisheries. But the deeper challenges of this arrangement would not stay hidden for long. Local fishermen in Gabon started to notice something unsettling. The fish stocks off the coast of Gabon began to dwindle. What had once been an abundant source of fish was now showing signs of overfishing. The amount of fish being caught was greater than the marine environment could naturally replenish. Fish species that had been plentiful were now becoming harder to find. This, of course, was bad news for Gabon's fishermen, who relied on the country's seas for their livelihoods. Meanwhile, on the European side, there were no immediate signs of the problem. The fish that European fleets were catching were being sold in European markets, and the demand for seafood was higher than ever. But as the years passed, environmental groups began to raise alarms. They worried that the European fleets were catching fish too quickly without considering the long-term impact on Gabon's marine ecosystem. Some environmentalists and critics began to speak out, questioning whether the fishing agreement was truly sustainable. They feared that Gabon's waters were being overexploited for the benefit of European nations, without enough concern for the health of the fish populations or the local communities. The situation wasn't just about money or resources anymore. It was about the balance between short-term gains and long-term sustainability. But for many years, the deal continued to roll on. Gabon was getting money and infrastructure, while Europe was getting the fish it needed. The deal appeared to be thriving. However, it was clear that the situation couldn't last forever without consequences. Over time, these concerns would grow, and the relationship between Gabon and Europe would begin to change. What had started as a partnership meant to benefit both sides was starting to show the first signs of strain. Despite the benefits it had brought to both parties, the cracks were starting to show. The future of the deal seemed uncertain as the question of sustainability loomed over both nations. Would Gabon continue to allow European fleets to fish its waters, or would it make a bold decision to change the arrangement entirely? The agreement, which had once seemed like a brilliant partnership, was beginning to unravel. In the following years, Gabon's leaders would face a critical decision. Would they continue to let Europe harvest from their waters, or would they take control of their own resources and shift their focus to protecting the future of their fisheries? It was a question that would soon have a profound impact on both Gabon and Europe. As the years went by, Gabon's once promising fishing agreement with Europe began to show signs of strain. What had initially seemed like a win-win deal started to raise serious questions, especially in Gabon. The local people began to notice changes in the once abundant fish stocks off their coast. For years, they had relied on these rich marine resources to feed their families and support their communities. But now, something seemed off. Gabon's coastal villages had long depended on fishing for their livelihoods. It was more than just a job. It was a way of life. The sea had always provided, and for generations, local fishermen had cast their nets into the waters with the expectation of bringing home a plentiful catch. But as European fishing fleets continued to operate in Gabon's waters, the fish seemed to be growing scarcer. The large European ships, with their advanced technology and powerful engines, were catching fish at a rate that was faster than the marine ecosystem could handle. For local fishermen, it wasn't just a matter of competition. It was a matter of survival. The fish they had once caught easily were becoming harder to find. The seas, which had once been teeming with life, were now showing signs of strain. This situation wasn't only worrying for fishermen, it was a concern for anyone who cared about the future of Gabon's marine resources. By 2015, environmental groups started raising alarms. They warned that overfishing in Gabon's waters was becoming a serious problem. They pointed out that European fleets, while providing much-needed revenue for Gabon's economy, were also taking more fish than could be sustainably harvested. The fish stocks were being depleted faster than they could replenish, and many feared that Gabon's fisheries were heading for a crisis. This was not just a local issue. It had global implications. The oceans are interconnected, and overfishing in one part of the world can have ripple effects that extend far beyond the local area. If Gabon's waters became overfished, it could affect marine life across the entire region, disrupting ecosystems and threatening the biodiversity that people in the country had relied on for centuries. At the same time, the financial benefits of the agreement seemed less impactful for many Gabonese citizens. While the government was receiving money from the Europeans in exchange for fishing rights, the everyday people were not seeing much of the promised improvement in their lives. The fishing infrastructure was better, But it was not enough to make a significant difference for local fishermen. Some fishermen in Gabon even reported that they were getting less fish than they had before, while European fleets seemed to take more than their fair share. As Gabon's fishing industry began to feel the pressure, questions were raised about whether the European deal was truly beneficial for the country in the long term. Was it enough for Gabon to receive financial aid in exchange for giving up its fishing rights? Or was there more to be gained by protecting the country's natural resources and ensuring their sustainability? Some government officials and environmental groups began to argue that Gabon needed to take a more active role in protecting its waters and managing its fisheries. But it wasn't just the fish that were at risk. Gabon's reputation was also at stake. The government had always been proud of its ability to protect its natural resources, but the agreement with Europe was starting to make some people question whether Gabon was truly in control of its own destiny. The country's leaders faced a difficult choice. Would they continue to accept the European deal and risk depleting their marine resources, or would they take a stand and fight for a more sustainable future? This tension grew louder as the years went on. In 2017, a major environmental report was released, confirming that the fish stocks in Gabon's waters were at risk. The report concluded that the rate at which fish were being caught was not sustainable, and that it would only be a matter of time before the fish populations began to collapse. The report sent shockwaves through the country, and it was clear that something needed to change. The Gabonese government was under increasing pressure from both local fishermen and environmental groups to take action. Local communities along the coast began to voice their concerns more loudly. They were frustrated by the situation and felt that they were being left behind in favor of European interests. They argued that they had not seen the promised improvements to their quality of life, and that the environmental costs of overfishing were too great to ignore. On the other hand, Europe was not blind to the situation. The European Union, along with individual European nations, began to realize that the fishing agreement with Gabon was becoming a more complicated issue. For years they had enjoyed access to Gabon's fish-rich waters, but now they were facing growing criticism for contributing to overfishing. The EU also found itself caught in the middle of a conflict between economic interests and environmental responsibility. While many European businesses and fishermen relied on the agreement, there was also a growing awareness of the need to ensure sustainable fishing practices. In response to the criticism, some European countries began to propose new regulations and measures to limit the amount of fish that could be caught. They suggested introducing more sustainable fishing practices and reducing the number of European vessels operating in Gabon's waters. However, these measures were not enough to satisfy the growing demands from Gabon's government and local communities. The situation had become more than just an issue of economics. It had become a matter of principle and national sovereignty. Gabon's leaders realized that they were at a crossroads. The country had enjoyed financial benefits from the agreement, but it was clear that the long-term consequences of overfishing could be disastrous for the country. The government faced a difficult decision. Should they continue with the agreement, or should they take control of their own resources and forge a new path forward? This question would soon lead to one of the most important decisions in Gabon's history. By 2020, tensions were at their peak. Gabon's leaders were faced with mounting pressure from environmentalists, local fishermen, and their own citizens to take action. The government began to hold internal discussions about whether the country should end the fishing agreement with Europe altogether. The risks of continuing the deal, especially with the growing environmental concerns, were starting to outweigh the financial benefits. As the government weighed its options, the people of Gabon watched closely. The fishing communities, which had seen little improvement in their lives despite the deal, were ready for change. They knew that something had to be done to protect their future and the future of their children. And as the situation grew more urgent, the world was watching to see what Gabon would do next. In this part of the story, I expanded on the building tension and growing challenges that Gabon faced regarding its fishing agreement with Europe. It sets up the eventual decision-making process that leads to the turning point in the story. The growing pressure from local communities, the environmental impact, and the global implications all create a sense of urgency and anticipation for what's to come. By the year 2023, Gabon had reached a critical juncture. The fishing agreement with Europe, which had once seemed like a solution to the country's economic struggles, had turned into a point of serious contention. For nearly 2 decades, the European Union had been allowed to fish in Gabon's waters, taking a large share of the fish from the country's abundant seas. In exchange, Gabon had received financial aid, modern technology, and promises of infrastructure improvements. But now the costs of that deal were becoming more apparent than ever before. Local communities along Gabon's coastline were feeling the pressure. The fish they had once relied on were becoming harder to catch. Overfishing, which had been quietly growing over the years, was now an undeniable issue. Environmental experts had been warning about the long-term effects for years, but the damage was becoming too evident to ignore. Gabon's waters, rich in fish, were beginning to show signs of depletion. Local fishermen could no longer catch the quantities they once did, and fish stocks were declining rapidly. At the same time, the people of Gabon were frustrated. They had heard promises of development and improvements to their fishing industry, but for many, those promises had not been fulfilled. The financial benefits from the deal seemed to disappear into the pockets of the government or the foreign companies involved, rather than improving the livelihoods of the average Gabonese citizen. The average fisherman saw little change in their daily lives. The equipment provided by the Europeans was helpful, but it didn't solve the bigger problem: the depletion of fish stocks. The government of Gabon found itself under increasing pressure. The local population was growing discontent with the deal, and environmental groups were pushing for change. There were protests in coastal villages, where fishermen rallied for better protection of their resources. Some spoke out loudly against the agreement, accusing the European fleets of taking too much and leaving little behind for the locals. The dissatisfaction was not only local, it was becoming an international issue. Gabon's natural resources, especially its fisheries, were under threat, and the people of the country felt it was time to act. Gabon's government, led by President Ali Bongo, had always been known for being pragmatic. But even the most careful leaders can only ignore a growing crisis for so long. The situation had reached a point where Gabon's leaders could no longer stay silent or continue business as usual. After much internal discussion and debate, the government made the momentous decision to terminate the fishing agreement with Europe. This decision was not taken lightly. There were risks involved, and the consequences were significant. The European Union had been a partner for many years, and the fishing agreement had brought substantial financial resources to Gabon's economy. Ending the deal could lead to economic losses, and it could strain diplomatic relations between Gabon and several European nations. Some feared that this bold move might lead to a loss of crucial support from the Europeans, who had been providing financial aid and expertise. But the government of Gabon had reached a breaking point. The health of its marine resources and the future of its people had to come first. The decision was made publicly in 2023, and it shook the international community. Gabon's leadership explained that they could no longer allow European fishing fleets to continue operating in their waters at the expense of local communities and the environment. The government also made it clear that they were committed to ensuring the long-term sustainability of their fisheries, even if it meant facing economic challenges in the short term. The announcement was met with a mixture of surprise, disappointment, and even anger from Europe. For years, the European Union had relied on Gabon's fishing grounds as a key source of seafood. The EU had invested heavily in the partnership, and many European fishermen and businesses were concerned about the future of their operations. Some European nations, particularly Spain and France, had significant fishing fleets operating in Gabonese waters. They feared that Gabon's decision would disrupt their businesses and force them to find new sources of fish elsewhere. In response, European diplomats attempted to negotiate with Gabon's government, offering new proposals and assurances. They promised to work with Gabon to implement more sustainable fishing practices and to provide additional support for local fishermen. But the Gabonese government had made up its mind. They had seen the long-term damage done by overfishing, and they were determined to regain control of their own resources. Gabon's leadership was no longer willing to accept a deal that prioritized European interests over the well-being of their own people and environment. The announcement was a clear message that Gabon was ready to take charge of its future. It marked a turning point for the country, as they sought to assert their sovereignty over their natural resources and ensure that their fisheries would remain viable for future generations. The decision to end the fishing agreement was more than just a political move. It was a statement of independence. Gabon was no longer willing to allow foreign interests to dictate the future of its fisheries. For Europe, this was a bitter pill to swallow. The fishing agreement had been beneficial for many years, and it had allowed European nations to secure a steady supply of fish. But now, they were faced with a country that was unwilling to cooperate on terms they had once agreed to. The fallout from Gabon's decision was felt across Europe, and it sparked debates about the future of other similar agreements between Europe and African nations. But for Gabon, the decision was one of empowerment. The government knew that the road ahead would not be easy. They would need to find new ways to develop their fishing industry, and they would need to ensure that the fish stocks were protected from further overfishing. They also needed to invest in sustainable fishing practices and help local fishermen improve their techniques and equipment. The decision to end the fishing agreement also marked a shift in Gabon's approach to international relations. The government made it clear that they would no longer allow their resources to be exploited without regard for their long-term sustainability. They would seek new partnerships with countries that shared their commitment to protecting the environment and promoting sustainable development. As Gabon began to chart a new course, there were challenges ahead. The country had to navigate the delicate balance between preserving its natural resources and ensuring that its people had access to the benefits of those resources. The fishing industry was crucial to the economy, but it needed to be managed in a way that would not jeopardize the future. In the end, Gabon's decision was not just about the fishing industry. It was about taking control of the country's future and ensuring that the needs of its people came first. The move to terminate the fishing agreement with Europe sent a strong message to the world that Gabon was ready to chart its own path, one that prioritized sustainability, local development, and national sovereignty. The world watched as Gabon moved forward with its bold decision, wondering what would come next. Would other African nations follow Gabon's lead and take a stand against unfair fishing agreements? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain. Gabon's decision to end the deal had changed the landscape of international fishing agreements, and it had set a powerful example for other nations seeking to protect their own natural resources. This part of the story builds on the critical decision made by Gabon's government and its implications for both Gabon and Europe. The narrative highlights the internal and external pressures that led to the breaking point, the response from European nations, and Gabon's new direction for the future. Let me know if you'd like me to continue with the next parts. When Gabon announced its decision to terminate the fishing agreement with Europe, the world took notice. The European Union, which had relied on access to Gabon's rich fishing waters for nearly 18 years, found itself facing an unexpected crisis. For years, European fishing fleets had been operating freely in Gabon's seas, catching large quantities of fish to supply European markets. This access had been an essential part of Europe's seafood industry. Now, Gabon's decision had upended that arrangement, and the impact was immediate. The reaction from European countries was mixed. Some governments, particularly those in Spain and France, were frustrated by Gabon's bold move. These nations had invested heavily in the agreement over the years, with fleets of fishing boats operating off Gabon's coast. The decision to cut off access to Gabon's waters meant that their fleets could no longer rely on the plentiful fish in the region. It also meant that their seafood industries faced potential shortages, which could lead to rising prices and a reduced supply for consumers in Europe. For the fishing companies and businesses that depended on the steady flow of fish from Gabon's waters, the news was even worse. These companies had built their operations around the access granted by the agreement, and now they were faced with the challenge of finding new sources of fish. Some fishing fleets had already begun to explore, other parts of the world. But the sudden loss of access to Gabon's waters created a serious disruption. These businesses had to scramble to adjust their operations, and many were left wondering what the future would hold for their industry. The European Union itself, along with its member nations, quickly responded with diplomatic efforts. Leaders in Europe began to express their disappointment, arguing that the fishing deal had been beneficial to both sides for nearly 2 decades. European officials tried to reach out to Gabon's government in hopes of renegotiating the deal, or at least coming to some form of compromise. They suggested that Europe could invest in sustainable fishing practices, introduce stricter regulations, and even provide additional financial aid to support Gabon's fishing industry. The hope was that these concessions would persuade Gabon to reconsider its decision and restore the agreement. However, Gabon's leaders remained firm. They had made it clear that they could no longer accept the status quo. Overfishing, they argued, had taken a heavy toll on their marine resources. Local fishermen, environmentalists, and citizens had demanded action, and the government had no choice but to act in their best interests. Gabon's decision was about more than just the fishing industry. It was about protecting their environment, ensuring the sustainability of their resources, and improving the lives of local communities. The government understood that the road ahead would be difficult, but they were ready to face the challenges. As European officials continued to push for a compromise, the Gabonese government made it clear that they would not simply roll back their decision. The damage caused by years of overfishing was too great, and the health of their marine environment had to come first. The country's leadership emphasized that they were not closing the door to future partnerships with Europe. Instead, they were seeking a more balanced and sustainable approach, one that would put Gabon's interests at the forefront and ensure that local communities would benefit from any future agreements. While Europe continued to express disappointment, Gabon's decision sent a powerful message to other nations. The move was a signal that African countries were no longer willing to allow their resources to be exploited without regard for their long-term welfare. Gabon was leading by example, showing that even a small country could take bold action to protect its natural resources and shape its own future. In the aftermath of the announcement, tensions between Gabon and some European countries continued to rise. Some European businesses that relied on fish from Gabon began to lobby their governments, pushing for pressure to be put on Gabon to reopen access to its waters. The situation became even more complicated as European nations debated how to respond. Some leaders advocated for a softer approach, hoping to preserve diplomatic relations with Gabon and maintain access to its fishing grounds. Others, however, were more hardline, arguing that Gabon's decision could set a dangerous precedent for other African nations looking to renegotiate similar agreements. At the same time, environmental organizations across the globe praised Gabon's decision. Groups that had long warned about the dangers of overfishing and the depletion of marine resources saw this as a victory. They applauded Gabon for taking a stand and prioritizing the health of its environment over short-term economic gains. The decision was seen as an example of responsible resource management, and it sparked a conversation about the need for more sustainable practices in global fisheries. Back in Gabon, however, the government was focused on the future. While the decision had caused a stir internationally, the country knew that it needed to take steps to rebuild its own fishing industry. Gabon's leaders were committed to ensuring that the country could thrive without relying on foreign fishing fleets. This meant investing in local fishermen, providing them with the tools and training they needed to succeed, and implementing stronger protections for marine life. The government also turned its attention to creating new partnerships, ones that would be based on mutual respect and a shared commitment to sustainability. Gabon was not shutting its doors to the world, but it was clear that the country wanted to control its own resources and make decisions that were in the best interest of its people and its environment. Gabon began seeking out new agreements with countries that shared its values of sustainability and fair trade, looking for opportunities to partner with nations that understood the importance of protecting the world's oceans. As the months went by, Europe continued to adjust to the loss of access to Gabon's fishing waters. Fishing companies scrambled to find new sources of fish, and European governments sought to smooth over tensions with Gabon. Diplomatic talks continued, but it was clear that the relationship between Gabon and Europe had changed forever. Gabon had sent a clear message. No longer would it allow its resources to be exploited without considering the long-term effects on its people and its environment. The fallout from Gabon's decision was not just a temporary issue, it was a turning point in global discussions about resource management and sustainability. Gabon's bold move forced countries around the world to rethink how they engaged with African nations and their resources. It made clear that the days of one-sided agreements and exploitation were numbered. Gabon had taken a stand, and in doing so, it had shown the world that the time for change had come. In the end, Gabon's decision to cut ties with Europe over its fishing agreement had far-reaching consequences. It shifted the balance of power in the fishing industry, redefined international relations, and created a new framework for sustainable development. Gabon had set a powerful example for other countries, showing that even the smallest nations could stand up for what was right and take control of their futures. In this part, the aftermath of Gabon's decision to end the fishing agreement with Europe is explored. The reactions from European nations, the diplomatic efforts, and the praise from environmental groups are highlighted. The focus then shifts to Gabon's efforts to rebuild its own fishing industry and create more sustainable partnerships in the future. The impact of the decision reverberates beyond Gabon, forcing a global conversation about sustainable resource management. With the decision to end its fishing agreement with Europe, Gabon had crossed a significant threshold in its history. The country had faced immense pressure from various corners: Europe, local businesses, and even international organizations. But Gabon had made a bold choice. The decision to prioritize its environment and people's future, even if it meant disrupting long-standing economic ties, marked the beginning of a new chapter for the nation. Now, Gabon had to focus on what came next. The challenge ahead wasn't just about cutting ties with Europe. It was about creating a sustainable future for its fishing industry, improving the livelihoods of its people, and restoring the health of its marine resources. It was clear that the future of Gabon's fisheries depended on the country's ability to manage them carefully, ensuring that fish stocks could thrive again. The local fishing communities who had been so impacted by the depletion of fish in their waters would be central to this effort. The Gabonese government knew that rebuilding the fishing industry would require significant effort. For years, local fishermen had struggled to compete with the industrial European fleets, but the government was determined to change this. Gabon's leaders took swift action to introduce new policies aimed at improving the local fishing industry. They began to offer more support to local fishermen by providing them with better equipment, training, and access to new markets. The goal was to help these fishermen become self-reliant, capable of catching fish sustainably without relying on foreign fleets. The government also introduced new rules to protect Gabon's marine resources. These regulations aimed to ensure that fish stocks were allowed to regenerate and that the ecosystem could recover from the damage caused by overfishing. Fishing quotas were set, and certain areas were designated as protected zones, where no fishing could take place. This was an important step in safeguarding the future of Gabon's fisheries. For the first time, there was a strong commitment to ensuring that the seas would remain abundant for future generations. In addition to these efforts, Gabon launched campaigns to raise awareness about the importance of sustainable fishing. Local communities were encouraged to embrace environmentally friendly practices and to help monitor the health of the marine environment. With the right education and resources, Gabon hoped that its people would take an active role in preserving their seas. The government worked closely with scientists and environmental organizations to ensure that their strategies were based on sound research and best practices. One of the most significant steps Gabon took was to invest in its fishing infrastructure. The country built new ports, upgraded processing plants, and improved transportation networks. The goal was to create a modern, efficient fishing industry that could meet the demands of local markets and international customers. By strengthening the infrastructure, Gabon aimed to reduce its dependence on foreign companies and create a more self-sufficient economy. But Gabon's vision wasn't limited to fishing alone. The country also sought to diversify its economy, so it wouldn't rely so heavily on one sector. Gabon had rich reserves of oil and timber, and the government began investing in these industries as well. However, the focus was always on sustainability. Gabon didn't want to repeat the mistakes of the past, where natural resources were exploited without consideration for the environment. The country began to explore more sustainable ways to manage its oil and timber industries, ensuring that these resources would continue to support the nation for years to come. As Gabon worked to rebuild its fishing industry and strengthen its economy, it also turned its attention to its relationships with the rest of the world. The decision to sever the fishing agreement with Europe had been a strong statement of independence, but Gabon wasn't turning away from the global community. In fact, Gabon's leaders knew that the country's future would depend on forming new, more equitable partnerships with other nations. Rather than focusing solely on Europe, Gabon began seeking out new alliances with countries that shared its vision of sustainability and fairness. These countries, like China and some in the African Union, were more open to discussing terms that could benefit both sides without taking advantage of Gabon's resources. Gabon's government was clear about what they wanted: partnerships that respected their sovereignty and prioritized long-term sustainability. As Gabon continued to grow, the focus was on building mutually beneficial relationships based on respect and shared goals. The story of Gabon's transformation wasn't just about fishing. It was about national pride and empowerment. The country was learning how to stand up for itself, how to control its own resources, and how to make decisions that were in the best interest of its people. This shift was a powerful message not just for Africa, but for the world. Gabon's decision to take charge of its resources showed that even small nations could change the rules of the game, no matter how powerful the other players were. One of the most inspiring parts of Gabon's new vision was the involvement of its citizens. The people of Gabon, particularly those who lived along the coast, had always depended on fishing for their livelihoods. Now they were becoming more involved in the decisions that affected their future. Through local meetings, educational campaigns, and community-based initiatives, the government worked to engage its citizens in the process of building a sustainable future. Gabon's new approach had a ripple effect beyond its borders. Other countries in Africa and around the world began to take notice. Gabon's decision to prioritize the long-term health of its environment and its people set a new example for how natural resources should be managed. Other nations that had been stuck in similar agreements with European countries started to consider Gabon's example and question whether they too could take control of their own resources. The fishing industry in Gabon began to show signs of recovery. Fish stocks, while still in a delicate state, began to stabilize. Local fishermen reported catching more fish than they had in recent years, and many felt optimistic about the future. Gabon was becoming a leader in sustainable resource management, and its reputation was growing. The world was watching, and Gabon's story became one of hope and determination, a story of how a country could take control of its destiny and forge a new path for future generations. By 2025, Gabon was no longer the small, overlooked nation it once was. It had become a model for other countries seeking to protect their natural resources while fostering economic growth. Gabon had proven that with strong leadership, a commitment to sustainability, and the support of its people, a country could overcome challenges and build a better future for itself. In the end, Gabon's decision to end the fishing agreement with Europe wasn't just about ending one deal. It was about creating a new way forward, one where the country could protect its resources, empower its citizens, and form new relationships that were fair and sustainable. It was a new beginning for Gabon, and as the world watched, the country set an inspiring example of how nations could take charge of their own futures. In this final part, the narrative emphasizes Gabon's transformation into a self-reliant nation, focused on sustainability and fair partnerships. It highlights the positive changes in the fishing industry, the involvement of citizens, and the broader impact Gabon's decision had on global conversations about resource management. The story concludes with Gabon becoming a model for other nations and a symbol of